Owen Chase stood on the deck of the Essex, his eyes locked on the enormous shadow beneath the waves. It was a sperm whale, the largest he had ever seen, but there was something unnatural about its movements. They were deliberate and calculating. The first impact was deafening. The ship lurched violently as the whale slammed into its hull, setting Chase and the crew sprawling. He scrambled to his feet, shouting orders, but the men were in complete chaos. Before they could react, the whale turned, and its massive tail sliced through the water as it prepared to strike the vessel again. This time, the blow was catastrophic. Wood splintered like kindling, and the Essex began to groan and creak. Its hull was breached. Chase clung to the mast as water poured into the hold, realizing with chilling clarity that the ship was completely doomed. As the whale vanished into the depths, Chase knew their battle for survival was only beginning. What lay ahead would test not just their endurance, but their very humanity. A struggle that would become one of the most harrowing tales ever told. A story that would inspire the famous story of Moby Dick. The Essex, a 238-ton whale ship out of Nantucket, set sail in August 1819. It was bound for the Pacific whaling grounds. At the helm was Captain George Pollard Jr. He was only 29 years old, but had already experienced the brutal and lucrative world of whaling. His first mate, Owen Chase, was only 23. He was said to be young and ambitious. He was a seaman with a reputation for determination and grit. Alongside them was Thomas Nickerson, the 14-year-old cabin boy on his first whaling voyage and full of youthful curiosity. Whaling wasn't just an occupation, it was an obsession in the early 19th century, especially in Nantucket, which was the heart of America's whaling industry. Whale oil lamps lit and fueled the economy, and men like Pollard and Chase were hunters of this precious commodity. The Essex was considered small but sturdy. It was well suited for long voyages that could stretch years. By 1820, the Essex had been at sea for over a year. The crew of 20 had endured months of hard labor, fierce storms, and the unyielding monotony of the ocean. They already lost 2 whaleboats in rough waters, which was a dire omen for a ship reliant on those smaller vessels to pursue their quarry. Despite the setbacks, morale remained steady. Pollard's calm authority and Chase's fiery leadership kept the men focused on their goal. But the Pacific was vast and unforgiving. On the voyage's first leg, a sudden storm near Cape Horn had nearly capsized the ship, costing them 2 whaleboats. Losing those whaleboats, which were essential tools for the mission, really dampened the rest of the trip. Supplies already were stretched completely thin, and these became further diminished by the crew's constant need to repair what the sea had battered. And while Captain Pollard exuded a calm authority, some whispered that his youth made him overly cautious, hesitating when decisiveness was actually needed. First mate Owen Chase was the opposite, driven and bold, a man who believed success came only to those who took risks. As they sailed further into the whaling grounds, tension between Pollard's restraint and Chase's daring decisions began to simmer. Chase, eager to fill their dwindling barrels with precious oil, urged the crew onward, even as conditions worsened. The final warning came just hours before disaster struck. The men had successfully harpooned several whales earlier in the day, and in their haste to secure the catch, one of the remaining whaleboats had been damaged, which became a critical loss. The ship's carpenter worked feverishly to repair it as the Essex floated in the still waters of the Pacific, her crew tired and distracted. And then it happened. The sea itself seemed to hold its breath, and a massive sperm whale surfaced nearby, its enormous body glinting in the midday sun. At first, the crew thought little of it. Whales often display curiosity before fleeing. But this one lingered, watching them. A few men joked nervously about its size, but Pollard and Chase kept their eyes fixed on it. They had been so focused on trying to retrieve the harpooned whales with their damaged whaling boat that they didn't notice what was about to happen. Now, the mood would shift suddenly. When at first they were observing this whale moving slowly towards the boat, increasingly pick up the speed, and they knew a collision was imminent. Can't imagine the fear the crew was going through when that whale crashed into their vessel, but I know I wouldn't want to be there, especially considering they had very limited supplies and food. So you're going to want to stick around for this one. If you're enjoying this story so far, consider subscribing to the channel. Whaling ain't easy, and those likes and subscribes keep us afloat. Thank you. I thought I'd add that cringy joke in there and show my face just so you know that I'm not AI. Anyhow, we'll move on because I know you guys like action. Now we left off the Essex and the crew watching in horror as this whale is speeding up to strike the boat. And the first strike came hard. The Essex was a ship built to conquer the vast ocean in its hunt for giants, and all of a sudden it had become prey. This massive sperm whale, a leviathan of the deep, had emerged from the depths, its head nearly the size of a small boulder. It was covered from scars from battles unknown. Sperm whales are among the largest predators on Earth, reaching lengths of up to 60 feet and weighing as much as 50 tons. Yet this creature seemed even larger as it bore its head down towards the ship. Was this an act of revenge for the whales that lay harpooned nearby? Or for the many whales that the Essex had killed over the years? None of that was probably going to this crew's head. They were just fighting for survival. The whale struck with such unimaginable force, its blunt head smashing into the wooden hull. The Essex groaned under the impact, the sound of splintering wood mingling with the screams from the crew. Men were thrown onto the deck, their balance lost as the ship lurched and swayed. Some scrambled for tools while others clutched to the rigging for dear life. Captain Pollard barked orders, but the chaos drowned out his voice. Owen Chase, the first mate, stood completely frozen, in awe as he stared at this large beast. Its sheer size and ferocity defied understanding. Just as everyone started to think things were settling down, they looked and they could see the tail of the colossal whale thrashing the water into a furious foam. This thing wasn't fleeing. No, this behemoth was preparing for another assault. Chase, gripping the railing of the bow, watched in disbelief as the whale moved almost with calculated precision, its massive body undulating through the water. This was not a random collision. This whale charged again, faster this time, its huge head aimed like a battering ram. Now this second strike was completely catastrophic. Immediately the men in the crew began to scramble, trying to salvage what they could. Barrels of water, hardtack, and tools, anything that they could for repairing what was left of their whaleboats. The Essex let out a low, agonized groan as its hull was completely breached. Seawater began to pour into the hold, and that's when the crew knew this thing was doomed. Panic filled the air as the ship began to lurch and shift dangerously. Thomas Nickerson, the young cabin boy, clung to the rigging, his eyes wide, reflecting the terror on everyone's face. The crew was able to scramble and get 3 damaged whaling boats into the water as the Essex sank beneath the waves. The crew was left adrift in the vast and indifferent Pacific Ocean. They were hundreds of miles from the nearest land. Their only source of shelter was that ship, and it seemed like all their hope had disappeared as it slowly slipped beneath the ocean's surface. What could cause this whale to attack with such ferocity? It remains a mystery. Was it injured? Was it enraged? Did it have the capability to feel anything? Or was this just an animal defending its territory? Whatever the cause, the singular act of defiance sealed the crew's fate. They were now lost adrift. The men would soon learn that survival would demand more from them than they could ever imagine. The vastness of the sea, the meager supplies, and the haunting memory of the whale's vengeance would test their bodies and their minds in more ways than you could possibly imagine. The anxiety, the terror of floating now in those small whaling boats, knowing that that same whale that just sunk the much larger Essex was somewhere nearby, must have been weighing and eating away in everyone's minds. And as terrifying as this whale must have been for the crew, it wasn't the only thing that was going to try and kill them. The men clung to their fragile whaleboats as the vast Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly around them, a shimmering, desolate void with no land in sight. Essex was gone, swallowed by the ocean, and with it, the tools and resources they needed to sustain themselves. Captain George Pollard Jr., First Mate Owen Chase, and the remaining crew divided into 3 small boats, each no more than 25 feet long. The vessels were designed for hunting whales and were woefully inadequate for surviving the open ocean. Their provisions were pitifully sparse. A few barrels of water, a few hardtack ship's biscuits, which had been stale and crumbling, and minimal navigational tools. Chase took on the grim task of rationing supplies, distributing what little they had with precise calculations. Each man received 1 sip of water per day, carefully meted out from the dwindling barrels, and a fragmented hardtack soaked in seawater to make it edible. These pitiful meals became part of a daily routine designed to stave off madness and as much hunger as possible. Initially, their course seemed promising. They would head for the Society Islands, 1,200 miles west. They would get as far away as possible from this whale that might come back and try to kill them. But whispers of danger started to circulate among the crew. There were stories of cannibals on those islands. There was whispered tales that had passed down through whaling ports, and as terrified as the men were of the whale, they still decided to alter their route. Instead, they chose to head towards South America, nearly 2,000 miles away. Unfortunately, a decision that would have dire consequences. After weeks of brutal exposure to the sun, salt, and waves, a glimmer of hope appeared. The men spotted a small island, Henderson Island, a remote and uninhabited island, and they scrambled ashore in search of fresh water and food. At first, the island seemed like salvation. Green water collected in rocky depressions and seaweed provided scant nourishment. Yet, it quickly became clear that the island could not sustain all of them for long. The group faced a choice: stay on the island and risk starvation, or venture back out and face the open ocean. After intense debate, 3 men, William Bond, Seth Weeks, and Thomas Chappell, chose to remain behind, clinging to the mere resources of the island and hoping that rescue would come. The others, led by Pollard and Chase, returned to their small whaleboats, heading back to the Pacific Ocean with the faint hope of reaching South America. Weeks would pass, and the Pacific's unrelenting elements took their toll. The 3 boats struggled to stay together. They were battered by waves and storms. Navigational errors and sheer desperation eventually caused the boats to become separated. Matthew Joy's boat, hearing the weakest among them, fell behind and was lost to the others. It was never seen again, and none of its crew survived to tell their story. For those who remained, the sun scorched their skin day by day, leaving it blistered and raw, while frigid winds at night cut through their clothing and sapped their remaining strength. Their once strong frames were wasted away, their ribs jutting out like skeletons barely clothed in flesh. Starvation made their thoughts foggy, their movements slow, and their decisions hampered. Some began hallucinating, seeing phantom islands or ships on the horizon. These cruel mirages brought arguments that flared briefly before collapsing into exhausted silence. Then came the unthinkable. As the days dragged on, men succumbed to thirst, hunger, and exposure. At first, the dead were given solemn sea burials, their bodies lowered into the ocean with a whispered prayer. But as hunger gnawed into their resolve, desperation overpowered morality. The survivors began to look at the bodies of the fallen crewmates not as comrades, but as sustenance. At that time, maritime law, unwritten yet understood, made cannibalism an acceptable practice if it was a last resort and the situation was dire. The standard practice, which this crew would undertake, was drawing lots in an attempt to preserve some sense of fairness. The chosen man, who would essentially draw a short straw, would accept his fate with quiet resignation, knowing that his death would give the rest of the crew the ability to live. So essentially, standard practice at sea is having a lottery to see who gives up their life so that the other people can eat and sustain themselves until rescue. Now, after weeks at sea, this crew realizes that they're at the point where they're going to have to consider eating each other. And they decide to do this in the most fair way, as laid out in the understood maritime law of that time. And they will draw lots. And one of the darkest moments happens in Captain Pollard's boat, where tragedy became deeply personal. After the lots were drawn, a young man named Owen Coffin draws essentially the short straw. He was Pollard's young cousin. Now, Pollard was stricken with guilt, and he offered to take the boy's place, but Coffin refused, demonstrating a courage beyond his years. He was only 17 years old. Coffin refused to let him take his place, and Coffin accepted his fate, knowing it would sustain the others. The crew then killed him, an act that weighed heavily on all aboard, but most profoundly on Pollard. The act of consuming one's own kin, even in a survival situation, was said to affect Pollard for the rest of his life. It was one decision that would not just mentally affect him, it caused him to be isolated from his friends, his family, and his community. Now, I'm going to chime in here in this part and say, I don't know if I buy that story that Pollard, I'm sure Pollard was like, oh yeah, I'll take your place, but he never actually meant it. I don't know. If you meant it, you wouldn't let your 17-year-old cousin kill himself for you. I'm a little skeptical to believe the account that Pollard actually tried to step up in this young kid's place because, I don't know. At the end of the day, that was a 17-year-old and you're a grown-ass man. So that's kind of, yes, I am judging. I know times were different. But anyway, I'm not going to digress any further. I'm going to move on. So ultimately, though, this horrifying scene of people having to eat each other is what keeps the crew alive. And by the end of the journey, 7 people were consumed. Some after succumbing to starvation, and some through the grim ritual of drawing lots. This desperate act is horrifying, and it really paints a picture of the lengths that people are willing to go to survive. Owen Chase later chronicled these moments in his journal, his words heavy with the weight of what they endured. His entire story and his entire account of the Essex whaling disaster is actually been published, and his journal is available online if anybody's ever interested in reading that. I thought about doing like a 2 or 3 hour read of it here on the channel. If you want to see that someday, let me know. But anyhow, he describes the grief and the silence that would fall upon the crew after drawing lots. It completely changed their dynamic. I think mentally everyone was just gone at that point. And that's kind of what he describes. He describes essentially the cannibalism leaving scars far deeper than any hunger ever could, fracturing their humanity and essentially leaving them haunted for the rest of their lives. But this ordeal, though each bite of flesh brought them closer to survival, it brought them further from the men they had once been. And now here they are, adrift in the heart of the Pacific, and the men of the Essex finally discovered the true cost of survival, a cost measured in flesh, guilt, and the slow unraveling of their humanity. And after 89 days adrift in the Pacific, Owen Chase and the men of his whaleboat were near the edge of death. Their sunken eyes stared blankly on the horizon. Their bodies were nothing more than skeletons, barely moving except for the occasional dip of an oar. It's here at this time, finally, they run into another ship, the Indian. It had appeared on the horizon, and the men could scarcely comprehend what they were seeing. Rescue had become a concept so foreign that even as the sailors aboard the Indian pulled them back onto the deck, Chase struggled to believe they were actually safe. After nearly 3 months adrift in the Pacific, the survivors of the Essex were barely alive. Owen Chase and his remaining crewmates in one whaleboat were gaunt shadows of their former selves, their eyes sunken and vacant. The sea had stripped them of strength, humanity, and hope. When the sails of the ship of the Indian had appeared on the horizon, they stared in disbelief, not thinking it was real and thinking it was a hallucination. 2 weeks later, Captain Pollard's boat was found in even grimmer conditions. The rescuers recoiled at the sight. Pollard and Charles Ramsdell, the only survivors aboard, who sat in silence amidst the half-eaten remains of their last crewmate. Their skeletal forms and haunted eyes made them appear more like specters and ghosts than men. The rescuers almost hesitated to help them, unsure of how to approach what seemed like such a tableau of despair. I could imagine they thought maybe these men were dangerous. I mean, the guys were eating another person. And not all of the crew's ordeal had unfolded on the open ocean. Remember, days after the Essex sank, 3 of the men, William Bond, Seth Weeks, and Thomas Chappell, chose to remain on Henderson Island, the tiny, desolate outcrop over 1,000 miles from the nearest inhabited land. It was said that first they found solace in the island's mere offerings, rainwater collected in rock depressions and seabirds. As their supplies began to dwindle, their situation grew dire. They would be rescued by another ship after weeks. They were said to be malnourished and weak, yet alive. Proof that their decision to stay on the island, though it wasn't an easy one, it had led them to escape the horrors of the open sea and the absolute unimaginable terror of the cannibalism that happened on those boats. And in the end, 8 of the 20 crew members of the Essex would survive. For some, like Owen Chase, survival became a story to tell. Driven by a mix of resilience and ambition, Chase meticulously chronicled the ordeal in his journal, preserving the tale of the whale attack and their harrowing fight for survival. His words carried an eerie detachment, as though committing the horrors to paper was his way of mastering them. Captain Pollard, the story was less forgiving. Haunted by the decisions he made and the lives he could not save, Pollard returned to Nantucket a broken man. The whispers of cannibalism followed him everywhere, casting a long shadow over his return. Though his community awkwardly welcomed him at first, he retreated into solitude, unable to reconcile his actions with the judgment of those around him. The tale of the Essex became the haunting testament of the duality of survival. It was a story of extraordinary endurance and ingenuity, but also profound despair and moral compromise. For Chase, it was a path to grim notoriety. For Pollard, it was a weight he would carry to his grave. And for the world, it was a chilling reminder of the cost of human ambition, the indifference of nature, and the lengths of which men will go to survive. Chase's account will go on to inspire Herman Melville, whose classic novel, Moby Dick, immortalized the Essex's story in fiction. Yeah, it's a crazy story, and I just want to say thank you guys for joining in. I'm glad to be back after the Christmas break. I'm going to be probably releasing on Thursdays for the foreseeable future here. And yeah, thanks again for joining. If you haven't already liked the video, I would appreciate it. And have a great week. We'll see you soon.